Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Brad Fowler from FIA Tech. We'll be getting this kicked off in just a moment or two. As a heads up, I do believe all attendees are going to be muted for the start of this. However, everyone should be able to submit questions via the Q&A tool. So please do feel free to send those over. We will be and are recording this session, so please do have that in mind. And then we'll be getting started up momentarily. Thank you. All right, for those just joining, again, we'll be starting up in just a minute or two. We're just getting a few more folks on the line. This will be recorded. If anyone does have questions, please do feel free to submit those via the Q&A option within Zoom. Participants will be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but please do send over if there's any questions. Thank you. All right, excellent. I do see that we have a number of attendees in here, although I believe we're still waiting for a handful more folks. So I think we will give it one more minute. If everyone can be patient, if there are any questions along the way, please do send them in via the Q&A tool here. And we will review those and present them to the group at the appropriate point during the webinar. Again, everyone who will be joining will be on mute by default, but please do send any questions over through that tool and we'll be getting started momentarily. Thank you. Okay, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I think the moment we've been waiting for, we're going to get started with today's session. So as mentioned, for anyone who's newly joined, this session will be recorded. Everyone will be on mute by default, however, can use that Q&A option at the bottom of the page to submit any questions at any point throughout the webinar. We will be saving time for questions near the end, but if something crosses your mind that you'd like to raise, please do send it over. And we'll review it and get that one asked to the group. Additionally, if any questions come up to folks that they either don't want to raise in today's session for any reason, or that they think of later after the webinar is completed, please do feel free to send those over to databank@fia-tech.com. The team will be happy to review and get back to everyone. So without further ado, I'm Brad Fowler. I oversee client services for a number of our FIA Tech products, including our reference data tools we'll be touching on today. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Justin Hasnett, who oversees databank operations, including the cache and collateral tool that we'll be reviewing today. So with that, Justin, I think I'll flip it over to you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks so much, Brad, for the introduction. Of course, just to echo that, as mentioned, there will be a question and answer component at the end. So yeah, please feel free to shoot them on over for any questions you may have here. At the end, we'll try to address, as many as we can there, given the time that remains. But again, that being said, thank you again all so much for joining us today for our standardizing data sets for collateral management presentation. Where we will touch on a high-level overview of the landscape of collateral management today, what firms are generally facing in taking into account the information to handle this function at their firms, and ultimately the solution FI Tech has come up with here to address this for the industry as a whole, including the static data inputs for capturing, and we'll also do a brief overview of the file itself, right? And so I will start here by just giving a brief introduction for myself and the Databank Network division here in general at FIA Tech. Excuse me 1 second. Share this next screen. So yeah, quick introduction here. My name is Justin Hasnett. I am currently the Senior Manager of Databank Operations here, where I oversee a handful of the products and initiatives that we support and build out here in the Databank Network space. Myself and the Databank team here at FIA Tech are tasked with identifying and building out products and operational processes, really, which target areas of need or pain points even expressed by the market participants that we work with and that we talk to on a daily basis. And so, I'll actually go ahead and move on to the next slide here, actually, because I'd like to give a fairly comprehensive overview of the products that are included within that Databank network as mentioned at the moment, as well as the general approach really and the life cycle of this approach on how we not only build out but build upon these products and these data sets, including the collateral management data set, of course, that we'll be touching on here today. So as you can see on screen here, folks on call, they may be familiar with a number of similar data sets that we support for the industry as a whole today, including the position limits data bank, which is a file that we produce. It's been utilized for well over a decade across the industry and contains relevant position limit information applicable on major global exchanges in a standardized consolidated file. We also support the exchange fees data bank, which again, similarly contains transaction and clearing fee related information across major global markets in a standardized fashion. And if we take these two kind of data sets, which we refer to as the Databank core products, these have really served as the foundation and ultimately the approach to the build out of the remainder of the Databank network product suite that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here. Over the past few years, we've launched off a number of different services, including a foreign security futures index analysis data set, which outlines broad or narrow index classifications per regulations jointly maintained by the SEC and the CFTC, which impacts index trade eligibility for U.S. participants. We also have consolidated feeds that we're maintaining with broker code and corporate action data, as well as just a full suite of contract specifications, which are products in and of themselves, but also interact with other data sets in the Databank network by for example, integrating, let's say, a vendor symbology such as GMI or Bloomberg within your position limits feed or other data feed as needed, right? And again, to briefly go over the Databank network life cycle on the left here, if you start at the bottom right, you'll notice where it says aggregate. This refers to our approach to go out to the source documentation really across each of the markets in scope, which serve as really inputs to the data we ultimately populate in our data feeds. For the collateral management landscape, this means kind of grabbing data at the clearinghouse level published by the CCPs. But regardless, right, this monitoring, this collection stage allows us to ensure we are taking info straight from the source itself as published by the source, where it then, follows that life cycle, right? Where the data is then standardized, normalized, consolidated, enriched and enhanced where needed. And that's ultimately pushed out to firms to consume as a part of their operational process from there. So again, just kind of a comprehensive picture on screen here of what the data network kind of consists of today. Again, constantly being built out with the services on the right, and they all kind of follow this kind of life cycle events, right? Where we're taking all that info and ultimately pushing out a file or other service to end users from there. And so from here, it kind of makes sense to really just jump into the collateral management component itself, now that we've kind of touched on the overall approach and lifecycle that is widely utilized across the Data network. So to take a step back quickly and understand the landscape, it makes sense to rewind almost back to the 2008 financial crisis, where as a part of a wider approach to address financial market stability across the board, new regulatory measures and other requirements were introduced by regulatory bodies around collateral and margin requirements, starting then and in the years since, really in an effort to reduce the counterparty default risk or credit lending risk market participants were taking on in trading these products. And of course, what this ultimately meant was that the operational tasks that firms were left with really required them to implement processes and procedures which may not have been as high up on their radar as it may have been previously, or may have taken more resources than it may have previously as well. So yeah, in the collateral management space, it really means that firms today have a fairly heavy task of not only understanding what the acceptable collateral instruments are, which can be pledged across the markets they trade in, but they also need a process in place to understand the constantly kind of shifting static data and applicability status of collateral instruments accepted on these markets as well. Without a process in place to monitor the static around this collateral data, firms really run the risk of maintaining an outdated or incomprehensive schedule of these collateral instruments, which they understand to be associated with any particular market. And if they're maintaining this out-of-date info, that could have an overall negative impact on their bottom line in regards to cost savings or just kind of overall financial resources, right? So I'll pop on over to the next slide. Where the solution here, really, here at FI Tech, this is something that we came to understand from market participants as a whole, where it was, expressed that these aforementioned processes we just kind of touched on to capture and maintain all the static collateral data on a daily basis had ultimately really just become a highly manual and labor-intensive task taken on by operations teams who were, by and large, really dedicated to sourcing collateral data and in some capacity, punching in these values in their back office system, and really just maintaining a process around that going forward to ensure that their data was up to date. And so, the collateral management solution is designed to largely alleviate that task from firms by having a team here at FI Tech who's really dedicated to going to the source documentation at these CCPs each day, grabbing the latest information in regards to these acceptable instruments and the static data around them, and ultimately publishing that information out in a standardized, consolidated format each day. The scope of CCPs at this time is just around 40 or so, and really each of these markets has their own mechanism of publishing out or providing the static collateral data. Some may have these nice clean spreadsheets where they are providing this information on a regular basis, and more often than not, for a lot of these markets, the acceptable information is embedded within language on a web page, or even buried within rulebook language somewhere, right? There may be some table that they have on a somewhere on their site, right? And so, as we kind of briefly touched on there, the sourcing to ultimately standardize and consolidate this data is where we, are looking to come in and provide some real value to firms looking to have a really comprehensive, standardized picture of this data, which they can utilize each day, right? And so, ultimately, the high-level takeaway here is that subscribing to the collateral management service allows firms to alleviate the significant resources that are perhaps being dedicated today to collecting and maintaining this data on a daily basis. And so, again, by ingesting a daily file with the relevant static data parameters on these acceptable instruments, folks can kind of reallocate resources or other assets to ensure that the collateral that is being optimized as best as it can be, given the daily feed of the parameters captured and maintained by the team here. From here, I will up to the next slide where we can actually touch on the static data points themselves that we're capturing in the file. So starting on the left here, with the information, you can see kind of at the top, these are the high level fields that we're, again, plugging into the data set itself that we're capturing at the source. So we'll start, again, at the top, the CCP or the Central Counterparty Clearinghouse name is first off, and then the next field there mentions applicable program. Applicable program is a field used to indicate where, if any in particular programs may apply to collateral instruments. So for example, if it's applicable to maybe initial or variation margins, something of that nature, we can go ahead and plug it in that applicable program from there accordingly. Underneath that, you'll see two fields in regards to acceptable collateral type, and acceptable collateral. The inclusion of these two fields was designed to really provide a taxonomy, essentially, where the acceptable collateral type includes a high-level grouping of collateral instruments, which is standardized to a degree across the file, while the acceptable collateral type drills into further detail with the specifics as outlined by the CCP itself. Using the example on screen here, the acceptable collateral type says government securities, and that's really just a universal grouping that can be seen across the file. And then acceptable collateral itself mentions at a granular, more specific level what the actual acceptable collateral type is, as it is, again, outlined by the CCP. And in this case, United Kingdom government bonds is kind of the example there. Moving on to the next few fields here, we have what we call the ticker symbol group or ISIN field, where we indicate the collateral identifier really that's utilized by these CCPs. So in some instances, this may be an ISIN for a bond, for example, maybe a ticker for an equity. So really, it's any instance where a specific identifier is utilized, which we can then populate in this field. And additionally, whatever type it is, whether that identifier is an ISIN or is a ticker, et cetera, we can populate it in the next field accordingly, right? Next up is collateral country. So really, this is just the country code of the instrument, as well as currency information. Both the liability currency, so the currency of the margin requirement, as well as the asset currency of the instrument itself, populate as static fields in the file. So some of the more pertinent and consistently changing static data points are here. Are in regards to the maturity bucket and haircut information in the next few fields. Maturity bucket, as you can see here on screen, outlines the maturity range, essentially, for particular securities, both as a consolidated field and a more granular broken down field for firms looking to digest that information in a more programmatic fashion. So static parameters can oftentimes differ across maturity buckets established by the CCP. So the fields here are largely utilized to capture that information. On screen here, we see a 5 to 10 year maturity bucket at both a consolidated level, as well as broken down into 5 and 10 individually, with the years flags populating as well. And so that's kind of the mechanism to portray maturity buckets. The haircut, of course, one of the most relevant static data fields associated with collateral instruments is the evaluation percentage haircut taken when an instrument is posted as collateral. So again, we do see this field change quite often at the source level, which our team takes into account. And of course, this kind of updates and populates from there. Concentration limits and minimums round out the remainder of the static data fields, which populate in the file. These fields are designed to capture, concentration limits, which are the maximum amount of a particular instrument that can be posted as collateral, whether that's, at an individual or group level, with the same logic applying to any particular minimums where they're a collateral instrument, usually perhaps in the form of cash, it must be posted as a minimum amount. So for this setup, we have a couple of fields to capture this logic, including indicating whether a limit or minimum is at a group level, is it at an individual level per instruments, logic to tie any of those groups together, which must be considered together, for a common limit or minimum, as well as indicating really what type of limit or minimum it is. You know, is this at a numeric value? Is it a percentage? You know, whatever the case may be, populating that value as well as what the actual limits or logic percentage is, where these fields is also populating there as well. So again, those are kind of really the high level fields that are populating in the file and the static. So again, any market that's in the file, any changes to acceptable instruments, collateral or haircuts, concentration limits, minimums, et cetera, is something that the team is keeping an eye out for, and populating in the file from there accordingly. Now, in the next section here, something we haven't touched on in too much detail thus far is a data set that is also included in the collateral management service, where we are capturing the collateral fees associated with the posting of both cash and non-cash collateral instruments. You know, firms again had expressed a need into better visibility really into the rates charged across the CCPs for collateral postings. So on screen is a structure we've adopted to capture this information, which very slightly differs between the cash and non-cash instruments. But again, on screen, you can see we have outlined, we capture again the CCP and acceptable collateral type information, like we saw in the collateral instrument file. However, in this case, we then go into detail around membership types, which can have an impact on the rate, which is ultimately charged for posting collateral, as well as a general other requirements field, where really any stipulation put in place by the CCP in regards to the fees can be populated here to provide further, granular details around its applicability. And typically for both the non-cash and cash collateral fees, which we'll see outlined in the next few fields, is a rate applied and the value of said rate. For cash, this typically means that a benchmark rate is associated with the currency, and that's utilized, whether that's maybe the Fed funds rate or SONIA or whatever the case may be. The name of this rate is populated as well as the basis point spread applied to that rate, which is again generally utilized to capture the fees for posting these instruments. And yeah, I think I just about covered for this portion. So I think what we'll go ahead and do from here is actually pop into the file itself and take a look at a few examples. Markets with their static collateral components that we just went over a moment ago. All right. We'll go ahead and reshare my screen here. And what we'll see on screen is just an example of what the file looks like when folks kind of pull it in. It is available in CSV and Excel format each day where it's published. And what you'll see on again on screen here are a lot of the fields that we just touched on a moment ago. The one we have in particular right here is Eurex clearing. Eurex is one of the markets in the file that again has a lot of good granularity, a lot of good detail as far as what they're producing on their daily file of acceptable instruments each day. So, if we go through how we've adopted that into this format specifically, we see that Eurex clearing is a CCP. We have an applicable program here for margin, acceptable collateral type. In this case, they're keeping it kind of high level at the bonds component, but as we take a look into some of the other markets here in a moment, you can see that that also does differ quite a bit from CCP to CCP. Over here in the next field is a specific indicator or the specific code, in this case an ISIN, for these bonds that are acceptable. So, if you see this kind of comprehensive list of bonds, you can see the full suite of what's available each day from Eurex documentation as they produce it at the CCP level, right? The next field is indicative of saying that that is indeed an ISIN for that particular instrument. The collateral country itself is the kind of two-digit ISO code that we adopt to portray that information. And again, the liability and asset currency for any of these applicable instruments as well. The maturity bucket field we also touched on as well. In some cases, this is provided from the CCP, and in others, it's something that the team actually kind of puts buckets together for and populates accordingly based upon or maturity details for these bonds. So you can see here, each of these has a particular bucket that it's falling into, whether it's 0 to 1 years, 10 to 30, 5 to 10, whatever the case may be. You'll see that on in this field accordingly. And if you recall, we also touched on that broken down component too, where it's a bit more granular in indicating, if it's 1 to 3 year, 5 to 10 year, et cetera, in more broken down fields over here. In some cases where we can see that differ from a year, maybe the maturity buckets in terms of days or months even. So this is a good kind of field to kind of, again, break that down to as granular a level as we can there. The haircut percentage is next. Again, this is the evaluation percentage taken as any instrument is posted as collateral. So again, we see that figure change fairly often across the board there, and you can see that associated with each ISIN over here. Average haircut is also something we take into account from our kind of talks with certain firms. Some may utilize this, some don't, but really what this is an indicator of the average haircut across a grouping of products. So, excuse me, this takes into account the collateral country, the acceptable collateral type, and the maturity bucket. So for example, you could say, these German bonds, perhaps from the 5 to 10 year maturity bucket, something of that nature. They have an average haircut of this, and then you can kind of drill down into each one of those accordingly for their individual haircut in this field over here. The group and individual limits and other limits and minimum information, again, populates over here. What we touched on briefly was the approach, essentially, where anytime there is a group or individual limit that is applicable as a concentration limit, in this case, we see here that the admissible proportion for the issued capital is 25% here, populated as a percentage, and the value itself, all those kind of static data fields are captured essentially. But again, in many cases, it may just be NA for a lot of these if they don't have a concentration limit in place, don't have a minimum in place. But again, where that does apply, where that is applicable, it's something we're going ahead and plugging in from there accordingly.
Justin, one question that's come up a couple times actually is, folks saying this data set's actually really great stuff, but they use other products like GMI, and are curious about how we actually manage some of the product mapping for GMI. Is that something you can weigh in on this part, or do we want to wait until later for that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good one we could touch on at the moment, because what we wanted to do in building out this kind of data set was making sure that we weren't essentially pigeonholed into one particular methodology or kind of taxonomy, essentially. So what we did work with, and we do understand that a lot of folks do use GMI and have almost like a pseudo mapping, essentially, of what that acceptable collateral type kind of links up to, essentially, with what our understanding of what the GMI groupings are. That's kind of approach we wanted to take when it came to how we kind of ultimately populate these and kind of group them essentially across the board. So yeah, any folks that are using GMI, again, we understand that's kind of the one that a lot of folks have been entrenched with for quite a bit here. So we definitely want to take that into account while not also being kind of, fully tied into that, should that folks want to phase out or just kind of adopt another mechanism in general there, right? So great question, actually. And again, if anyone's kind of interested in what that looks like in practice across the board, definitely feel free to shoot us a note. We'd be happy to walk through that in further detail as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin.
Absolutely. So yeah, as mentioned there, right? I think with Eurex, this is pretty clean, pretty good example. They have pretty solid documentation that we can go off of when it comes to taking out these instruments and plugging it into the format accordingly. But if we go to something for, let's say, maybe a bit more complex in its applicability rules, I think LCH LTD is probably a good example for this as well, right? Where we could see that, while we're still taking, the same types of fields, the way that they produce this information is completely different, really. than how Eurex does, right? If anyone's familiar with what this may look like at the source, first of all, I don't envy you. Second of all, you may notice that that information is taken from, or is posted in PDF format. It's posted on the website. It's all kind of scattered all over the place, really, where it's this the components are there, and the way they fit in, is still something that the team sources and know where it comes from, but is again just kind of standardized and consolidated in a fashion that we look to plug into the format here accordingly, right? So over here, got a couple of different fields in terms of the acceptable collateral type and the acceptable collateral instrument itself that it drills down into. So LCH, they are accepting, just a wide range of acceptable collateral types, of course, right? We see government bonds, supranationals, cross currencies, cash, government agencies. They have a pretty wide range, really, when it comes to what they accept, right? And with these groups, they also have group codes that they're utilizing, which we've then also, taken a look at the source and adopted accordingly when it came to plugging that into the file itself. So, we could see that these particular codes for network rail, Renton Bank, Australian Bank, all these different ones, right? They're ones that we see populating at the source documentation itself, and have made a high level taxonomy over here in the acceptable collateral type, and then the acceptable collateral goes into that detail that we see specifically from the CCP documentation itself. And again, the same kind of fields that we went over previously, where we're seeing maturity buckets as they apply. Again, pretty crucial components if we see that change across the board, and how it has an impact on what's applicable from the CCP documentation, and the haircuts again are just kind of the cornerstones essentially for each of these applicable instruments. LCH in particular as well, you'll see has a lot of different limits in place that have varying levels of complexity and how they're kind of applied at the CCP level, right? So again, what we're doing is taking whatever that limit is, the values associated with them, the static associated with them, essentially, and providing a grouping mechanism. So over here, something we utilize essentially to portray which instruments are to be grouped together is this code over here. So if anyone's taking a look and says, LCH LTD 4 or 5, any unique code is indicative that there is a particular grouping mechanism in place when it comes to understanding the full scope of what that concentration limit or that minimum consists of, essentially. Maybe I'll just do one more example here for variety's sake. Why not? And we'll take a look at, let's say, BME. And again, really, this is just for visibility into the types of different ways CCPs can do it, and how it still ultimately, at the end of the day, still filters into the same file format and static data fields that we populate in the file. So again, right, we see government bonds over here as the collateral type. Acceptable collateral, this is essentially what we're seeing at the CCP level as far as what those what those groupings are called. In this case, we do have specific ISINs, which we plug in accordingly. And again, currencies, countries, ISIN or ticker, visibility, maturity buckets, haircuts, all that good stuff, right? And some limit logic is in place here as well. Now, again, those are some examples of what we see at the the static acceptable collateral instrument file. But as you recall as well, what we also touched on was the fee component. So I'll go ahead and share a sample of what the fees output looks like as well, and how we're capturing that static data. So we're on screen here. I'll just bring up LCH LTD again. a market that we just took a look at. And over here, we could see the different rates that they have populating on their website, which again, different page, different kind of source, but at the end of the day, there still is sourcing for any market that we capture in the file that we kind of monitor and plug in accordingly should we see any of these static parameters change. So in this case, we see all the different acceptable collateral types, again, much like we see on the other file format. If there is a membership type that has an impact on this rate, you'll see that in column E here. So, house clients, whatever the case may be. Should we see any sort of differentiation or just a membership type in general at the source documentation? This is our area where we can plug that in to provide detail for that membership type, essentially. Over here, we have other requirements. Again, we do see some variability of the applicability here across the board for the markets and scopes. So again, should there be any relevant information here, we can go ahead and plug that in. And for cash instruments in particular, as mentioned, the benchmark rate or the name of the benchmark rate is something that we're populating at this time to kind of understand the rate that's associated with the posting of those cash instruments. So in this case, they're indicating that this is the benchmark rate for the pound, Fed funds rate, et cetera. So we're taking that rate, and again, whatever the basis point spread is upon that rate is essentially what we're looking to capture in the fees file. And again, similar kind of scope across the board, where again, we can see the same kind of parameter values for acceptable collateral types, other requirements, benchmark rates, et cetera. So to summarize a bit, I think before we hop into the Q&A section there, I think we took a look, at the overall approach of what we were hearing really across the industry from folks in the collateral management space, how there was expressed as kind of a highly manual, highly kind of labor-intensive effort that firms were taking on to kind of capture and maintain this data on a daily basis, right? So again, seeing the data points that were captured across the board, how that's kind of set to be standardized, again, consolidated in this file format, which is produced each day. That's really the approach here as we look to kind of alleviate that function overall for firms who are really taking on that manual effort today.
Awesome. Thanks, Justin. If we'd like to move into the Q&A section, we've got a bunch of great questions that have come over. So if you'd like, I'll actually get some of these read on over. If anyone hasn't had a chance to submit questions yet that they'd like to have answered, please do throw them over in the Q&A tool. Or similarly, if it's one that you'd like answered separately for any reason, please do send that over to databank@fiatech.com. I'd be happy to review it. So I guess one that's come up, Justin, is are there any acceptable instruments for OTC per trade in the file? Is that something that we currently include?
Oh, sorry about that, muted. That's a great question, actually, because when we start the build out of this product, and really most products across the Databank network, what we focus on is the ETD, the exchange trade derivative component of it, where anything that we're seeing applicable to ETD specifically is kind of where that scope starts out when it comes to how we build out the product, at least that initial version, right? So as we've since introduced applicable program into the file itself as a new applicable field, what we're looking to explore in further detail across the board is how we can kind of utilize that field to highlight OTC applicability as well. So if an instrument is acceptable at both an ETD level and other programs, including OTC, we can also just kind of utilize the same format to, again, highlight if OTC applicability is also something we can utilize any particular instrument for. So again, great question. That's something we're exploring across the board. It's still focused on ETD at the moment, but if anyone has any particular use cases or markets of interest, please do feel free to reach out. Happy to explore that and chat about that with you guys from there.
Awesome, thanks, Justin. Another one that's come up from a couple spots, the taxonomy that you've described. Could you go into a bit more detail how we're utilizing it and how that fits into the file?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely something I'd love to touch on a bit further, because it does feel that that's a crucial component of how the acceptable instruments are captured in the file itself. So, you did hear us touch on and show a couple of, examples of the acceptable collateral and the acceptable collateral type. But really the high level purpose of the taxonomy structure overall is to really serve as like almost an anchor, so to speak, for these acceptable instruments which fall under the same type of asset class across the file. And from there, we can then kind of populate the specific details as they're outlined in the CCP without losing that level of granularity or detail, which we certainly didn't want to do in doing like a standardization or translation effort. And so, I think the problem a little bit that we ran into when building this out was that if the acceptable collateral types were populated only as they appear in the CCP documentation, it became increasingly tough to programmatically identify similar instruments. So this approach is one where we can, kind of take the opportunity to help provide some, semblance of standardization, as mentioned, while also I know some folks asked about GMI as well. Also, providing some sort of bridging to however they may be evaluating these instruments and tying that into our taxonomy as well. So again, great question on that. I hope that provides some clarity.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Another one, and I guess we have a bit more time for questions. Interest rates in the file, how are they handled for all the instruments that we have?
Yeah, I think we touched on that briefly in the fees component at the end there. So really what we're doing for the fees component and cash interest rates on cash collateral is taking that benchmark rate that we're seeing in the source documentation. Again, we saw a few different examples of that, whether that's Fed funds, that's Sonia, even for something like ICE, they have like the IDR that they utilize as their almost proprietary benchmark rate, right? And so if there's anywhere where we see this in the source documentation, that name of that rate is kind of populated in the file, the basis point spread associated with it. We are exploring kind of taking those benchmark rates in specifically across the board. But what you'll see for the most part, and what you'll see on screen here actually, is largely the approach that was adopted from folks, where we're taking, again, that rate, the rate associated with it, and populating that in the file, along with any static parameter changes. Should the basis, rate change or whatever the case may be, just kind of making sure that there's eyes on that gets file updated in the file from there.
Excellent, thanks. And one that you did touch on, but maybe there's a bit more to go on too. What identifiers are being used for acceptable instruments? I know you mentioned that GMI codes are available. Is there anything else in terms of identifiers that make sense to understand here?
Yeah, I think that's good too, because I think for the most part, what we're going to see are those ISINs across the board as the identifier that a lot of the CCPs are using. Ticker, we also touched on, grouping code as well, we touched on. So those can vary a little bit when it comes to the CCP documentation. Our goal really is to try and get to the most granular specific level of detail as we can there. But that is, generally what we're seeing for the most part across the board when it comes to the identifiers essentially that we're providing in the file. It does also open up the opportunity for us to reach out to CCP staff as needed to see if they have the most granular level that they are providing us. But overall, kind of what you see on their public source documentation or other files they're producing is generally what we look to adopt as well when it comes to the identifier information in the file here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And then Justin, I know we've got maybe time for like two more maybe?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Cool. I guess one other one just in terms of file updates, and I believe you said this is daily, but how often is this data updated? And where's the sort of security knowing that this is matching up with what the exchanges provide?
Yeah, of course. I know it's one of the largest considerations there for adopting the file. So what we do, we have a manual process where a team goes in for each market again that we cover in the file, right? So that happens on a daily basis. So for a CCP like Eurex, for example, we do understand that that's something that they do update on a daily basis. So every day They have changes to, acceptable instruments coming on, dropping off, their haircuts changing, essentially, right? We just know that's a process that happens every day. For something like, ICE or CME or maybe just another market, may not change that often. They may update the parameters overall, or they may, every couple of weeks or months even for some of the markets in scope. That's their kind of cadence or frequency that they may update things. But regardless, we're still looking at the source documentation every day, just to make sure that, whatever they do post is kind of captured and is set to be integrated in the file accordingly. So as far as frequency is concerned, we do monitor every day. We do publish the file every weekday as well. And so, yeah, the combination of those two means that we try and get the most, like comprehensive, up-to-date picture of whatever's populating in there. And again, that procedure is specific to each market in scope. So, we're pretty familiar with the source documentation. Again, that can and does change pretty often too. So again, the team is kind of just keeping eyes on it each day to make sure that whatever, is changing is captured and integrated in the file accordingly.
Awesome. That sounds great. Thanks, Justin. I suppose with that, I don't know if anyone else wanted to submit any other ones, but otherwise, I think any questions we couldn't hit or if folks wanted to submit one separately to the data bank group, we're definitely happy to take them that way. And Justin, I didn't know if you wanted to have any sort of closing remarks here.
No, thanks so much, Brad. I think, again, echoing that sentiment, thank you all so much for joining us today. If anything, again, does come up, any clarity or detail or just questions in general, we can help kind of, address or dive into in further detail. Certainly happy to do so. Our goal here really is to have this as an industry tool similar to the other product sets in the data bank network that we touched on. So again, if this is something your firm is kind of taking on or just is some sort of interest in general, yeah, again, please feel free to reach out and we'll be sure to get back to you.
All right, thank you all for joining today. We will be able to share a recording actually via the link that you used to register for this. So you should be able to access that. I believe it'll be a few hours before it's produced, but that should be there. As Justin shown on the screen, if there are any questions, please do reach out to Andrew Lamana, who is also on the call today. He'll be able to help get any more info to firms. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. Take care.